All right, get ready. Today we're taking a deep dive into how to totally nail that database designer interview. It's like having a cheat sheet, but way more fun.
We've got some awesome resources to guide us. RoleCatcher's Career Guide, the Interview Guide, and a goldmine of sample questions.
But before we jump into all that, let's paint a picture. What exactly does a database designer actually do? I mean, RoleCatcher says they map out database structures, figure out all the processes, and how information flows. Sounds pretty tech-heavy, but what about the human side of things?
You're not just stuck coding all day, you're a problem solver. Think of it like this. You're the architect, but instead of buildings, you're designing how a whole company uses its data. You're talking to different teams, understanding what they need, and making sure everything runs smoothly.
That's a way cooler way to think about it. So it's not just about the tech, it's about strategy and working with people.
Exactly. And speaking of strategy, RoleCatcher has these really cool AI features that can help you prep for your interview, right?
Oh yeah, I was going to ask about that. So how can AI help us get ready for those tough questions?
Well, the AI can actually look at job descriptions, see where your skills match up, and even suggest ways to tweak your answers to really highlight your strengths.
Oh, it's like having a personal interview coach.
Hmm.
Can you give me an example of how it would help with something like tailoring a CV for a specific job?
Let's say you're going for a job that really wants cloud database experience. RoleCatcher's AI might point out that you haven't clearly mentioned your AWS or Azure skills, and then suggest subtle ways to work those keywords into your CV.
It's like a secret weapon for speaking the hiring manager's language. Okay, let's get down to business. The actual interview questions. RoleCatcher gives us 10 sample questions, but let's focus on a few that really let you shine. Ready to dive in?
Absolutely, let's do it.
All right, first up, can you explain the process you use to design a database? Sounds simple, but what's the interviewer really getting at here?
It's not just about listing the steps. They want to see how you think. Can you take a complex problem, translate business needs into technical solutions, and do it all in a way that shows you're organized and you pay attention to details?
So it's all about showing that strategic thinking. What would be a good way to start tackling this question?
I'd start by emphasizing teamwork. Remember those typical interactions in the career guide. Talk about how you work with different people, gather the right data, and find those potential hiccups early on.
So it's about showing your team player. What else could you add to make your answer stand out?
Then walk them through a clear process, like starting with gathering requirements, then data modeling, schema design, and finally, implementation and testing.
Okay, that paints a pretty clear picture. Now, what if they throw a curveball and ask, how would you handle a situation where stakeholder requirements clash?
That's a great one. It really tests your ability to think on your feet. You could talk about prioritizing based on the impact on the business, finding compromises, and documenting everything to be transparent. You become a data diplomat, right?
It's like those database designer FAQs. In the career guide, they give you a glimpse into how pros handle those tricky situations.
Exactly. Showing that you've thought about these real-world scenarios is huge. Okay, next question. How do you ensure data integrity in a database? Seems straightforward, but what's the deeper meaning?
I think it's about showing that you understand data's value and that mistakes matter. It's not just theory, it impacts the real world.
Right on. The RoleCatcher report even had a case study where a company lost millions because of a data integrity issue. So, yeah, knowing how to prevent that is gold. Imagine you're designing a database for financial transactions or patient records or even self-driving cars. Mistakes aren't just typos, they can have serious consequences.
It really brings it home. What are some concrete things you'd mention to show you take data integrity seriously?
Well, the interview guide talks about constraints, rules, and handling errors. You could mention data validation checks, using foreign keys to make sure relationships are solid, and setting up ways to deal with exceptions.
So you're explaining the what's. But how could you make it come alive with a good example?
Imagine you're building a database for an e-commerce site. You could talk about setting up constraints to ensure product prices are always positive, quantities are never negative, and those customer addresses are actually real. Those little things show you're thinking about the practical stuff.
Perfect. That connects it to something they can easily understand. Okay, follow-up time. They ask, can you give an example of a time you fixed a data integrity issue? Now it's getting personal.
This is where you get to be the hero. Describe a situation where you swooped in, found a real data integrity problem, and fixed it. Explain the steps you took, the tools you used, and what happened because of it. Even a small win shows you can handle the pressure.
Okay, onto a topic that's always hot. How do you ensure database security? Data breaches are everywhere these days.
You're telling me they want to know that you're not just aware of the risks, but actively trying to stop them.
This is where those AI features from RoleCatcher could really come in handy, right? I
Right.
mean, you can look at what you're saying and suggest ways to make you sound like a security pro.
Totally. It can point out if you've missed mentioning important security measures and even help you phrase things in a way that emphasizes your proactive approach.
Like having a security consultant right there with you. Okay, back to the question. What are some solid security measures you'd mention to show you're on top of things?
The interview guide mentions authentication, authorization, and encryption as the big three. You could talk about strong password rules, controlling access to sensitive data, and making sure information is encrypted both when it's moving around and when it's stored.
That's a great multi-layered approach. Now, what if they throw a curveball and ask, what are your thoughts on cloud-based database security? How do you handle that?
Yeah. That's where you show you're staying up to date. Talk about the shared responsibility model in the cloud, where the provider handles the basic security of the infrastructure, and you focus on securing your data and apps.
It's a partnership, right? And it's a perfect chance to mention any experience you have with specific cloud platforms like AWS or Azure.
Exactly. Even if you don't have direct experience, you can talk about the security features they offer and how you'd use them to protect data.
Next question. Have you worked with SQL Server before? Seems like a yes or no, but how can you use it to showcase your experience?
Don't just say yes or no. Go deeper. Even if you haven't used it much, give specific examples of projects you've worked on, features you've used, challenges you've overcome. Tell your SQL Server story.
So instead of just yes, you could say something like, I use SQL Server to design a complex database for customer management system, using stored procedures and triggers to automate stuff.
Exactly. You go from a simple answer to showcasing your skills. And if you're not a SQL Server pro, talk about your experience with other systems and highlight what you've learned that you could apply to SQL Server.
It's all about adaptability. Now, here's one about protecting that precious data. How do you handle data backups and recovery? This isn't just technical. It's about safeguarding the heart of a company.
Totally. Data loss can be a nightmare, so the interviewer wants to know you've got a plan. This is another place where RoleCatcher's AI can be super helpful. It checks your answer and makes sure you're hitting all the key points like types of backups, frequency, and how you'd recover data.
Like a safety net.
Mhm.
Okay, back to the question. How do you approach this in a way that shows you're not just going through the motions?
Start with your backup strategy. Mention different types of backups. Full incremental differential. Explain why you choose one over the other and how often you'd back things up. It's about showing you've got a system.
Okay, so backups are covered. But what about the worst case scenario, actual data loss? How do you talk about recovery without panicking?
Explain your recovery process, step by step. How do you restore from those backups? How do you deal with different types of failures? And super important, how do you test that your recovery procedures actually work?
That level of detail shows you're not just hoping for the best, you're planning for the worst. What about disaster recovery planning? Should you mention that too?
Absolutely. This shows you're thinking big picture. Talk about your approach, like offsite backups, data replication, or even cloud-based disaster recovery solutions.
Okay, time for a question that might make some people sweat. Can you explain the difference between a clustered and a non-clustered index? Getting a little technical here, but how can you explain it to someone who might not be an indexing expert?
Start with the basics. Explain that indexes are like a table of contents for a database. They help you find data faster. Think of it like a library. An index helps you find the right book without searching every shelf.
I love that analogy. Now, how do you explain the difference between the two types of indexes?
Think of a clustered index like rearranging a bookshelf alphabetically. All the books are physically in order. A non-clustered index is like having a card catalog, a separate thing that tells you where to find a specific book on the shelves. One is about physical order, the other is about pointers.
Okay, makes sense. Now, how would you answer a follow-up question like, what would you choose one type of index over the other?
Imagine you need to retrieve a bunch of data. A clustered index would be perfect because everything's already sorted the way you need it. But if you just need a few specific pieces of information, a non-clustered index might be better because it doesn't take up as much space.
Very clear explanation. All right, back to security. How do you ensure database security? We've touched on this, but let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are some specific techniques that would really impress them?
Let's break it down into those layers of security: authentication, authorization, and encryption. For authentication, you could mention strong password rules, multi-factor authentication, and secure protocols like Kerberos or OAuth. You know those codes you get on your phone?
So you're showing them you're not just relying on one password to keep things safe. What about authorization? How do you control who sees what?
Talk about role-based access control. It's like giving people keys to only the rooms they need to access. No need to give them access to the whole building.
Love that analogy. And for encryption, you could talk about how it scrambles the data so no one can read it without the right key, like a secret code.
Exactly. You could mention different encryption algorithms like AES or RSA, and you can talk about encrypting data both when it's moving between systems and when it's just sitting in the database.
Super thorough. Now, for a potentially scary question, have you ever designed a distributed database? If you haven't, how do you answer without just saying no?
Be honest. If you haven't, just say so. But don't stop there. You can still show you understand the concept and the challenges involved.
So you're saying, I haven't done it myself, but I know what it is and I'm eager to learn. How would you explain a distributed database in a way that shows you get the basics?
Think of it like having multiple libraries instead of just one. You're spreading data across different physical locations. This is great for making sure the system can handle lots of data and users, and it can also make the system more reliable, because if one location goes down, the data is still accessible from other places.
That clearly explains the benefits. But what about the downsides? Designing a distributed database sounds pretty tough.
It definitely has its challenges. You need to make sure the data is consistent across all those different locations, you need to manage transactions that span multiple databases, and you need specialized tools and skills to make it all work smoothly.
That shows you're aware of the complexities. What if they follow up with, what are some things to consider when designing a distributed database? How do you answer that without hands-on experience?
You could talk about things like data partitioning, which is how you divide up the data, consistency models, which determine how you keep the data in sync, and conflict resolution, which is what you do when data changes in multiple locations. And don't forget to mention the need for special tools and expertise.
That's a great breakdown. All right, now for a question about handling change. How do you handle database migrations? Sounds like a massive task. What are the key things to focus on?
First, emphasize planning and communication. You're not just moving data around, you're coordinating a complex process that involves lots of people and could impact critical business operations.
So you're showing you understand the bigger picture. What specific steps would you outline to demonstrate you know what you're doing?
Walk them through the phases of a database migration, like converting data, making changes to the database structure, transferring the data, and of course, testing everything thoroughly. Explain how you'd approach each phase and what tools you'd use.
It's a very structured approach. But data migrations can be risky. How do you show you're taking the right precautions to avoid a disaster?
Talk about your risk mitigation strategies. Backups are essential, of course. Testing the migration in a safe environment before going live is crucial. Having a rollback plan in case something goes wrong is like having an escape route. And communicating with everyone involved throughout the process helps prevent surprises.
All great points. Okay, for our final question, let's go back to a fundamental concept. Can you explain the concept of database normalization? This is a core idea in database design, so how do you make it clear and easy to remember?
Think of database normalization like organizing your house. You're getting rid of duplicates and making sure everything is in its right place so it's easy to find.
Another great analogy.
Yeah.
How can you explain the different levels of normalization without getting too technical?
Use a simple example, like a table with customer info, where the same address is repeated for multiple customers. Normalization would involve creating a separate address table and linking it to the customer table, just like having a separate address book.
That's super clear. Now, why is normalization so important? What are the benefits of tidying up that data house?
Normalization reduces data duplication, which saves space and makes the database more efficient. It makes sure the same information is stored in only one place, which prevents errors. And it makes it easier to update information because you only have to change it in one place.
Those are some convincing benefits. Wow, we've covered a ton of interview questions, from the basics to some really tough ones.
You're now equipped with the knowledge to walk into that interview feeling confident. But before you do, let's take a break and come back to discuss those skills that go beyond just the technical stuff. Those are the things that can really make you stand out from the crowd. We've covered a lot of technical stuff, but being a database designer is more than just knowing SQL, right?
You got it. RoleCatcher calls these beyond technical skills, just as important as coding skills. Things like critical thinking, communication, and active listening.
And they're not just for building databases, they're crucial for interviews too. You need to be able to explain things clearly and make a connection with the interviewer.
It's about having a conversation, not just reciting facts, right?
Exactly. Let's look at the functions and core abilities from the career guide. Critical thinking, 59% importance rating. Makes sense. Database designers need to analyze complex problems, evaluate solutions, and make decisions based on logic.
Like a data detective. You're piecing together clues, and that applies to interviews too, doesn't it?
For sure, interviewers throw curveball questions to see how you think on your feet. They want to see you in action using those critical thinking skills.
So how do you show that in an interview? Is it about asking a lot of questions?
Asking clarifying questions is good. It shows you're engaged and want to understand the whole picture, but it's also about considering different angles, explaining your thought process, and not being afraid to talk it through.
It's like letting them see how your brain works. Okay, what about active listening? The career guide says that's really important too.
It's super important for everything, understanding what people need, working with your team, and in an interview, it shows you're genuinely interested in what the interviewer has to say.
Like, I'm here to have a conversation and really understand what you're looking for. How do you show that you're an active listener in an interview? Is it just about eye contact?
Eye contact is part of it, but it's more than that. Ask follow-up questions that make sense, summarize what the interviewer said to make sure you got it right, and even take notes. Show them you're paying attention.
Taking notes helps you remember things too, especially if they ask a follow-up question later on. Okay, let's talk about communication. Seems obvious for any job, but what makes it specific to a database designer?
Think about it. You're often the bridge between tech people and non-tech people. You have to be able to explain complicated stuff to people who don't speak database language.
So you're the translator, making sure everyone's on the same page, and that's super important for interviews too.
Big time. In an interview, clear communication can make all the difference. It's how you show what you know, connect with the interviewer, and leave a good impression.
We talked about what communication is. What about how to do it well? Any tips for making your communication really stand out during an interview?
Definitely. Use simple language, avoid jargon, and structure your answers logically. Take your time, think things through, and make sure you're answering the question directly. And the biggest thing is to practice. The more you talk about this stuff, the more confident you'll sound.
That's great advice. Okay, remember all those sample questions we went through? Let's go back to them and see how we can use these beyond technical skills to make our answers even better. Ready for round two?
Bring it on.
First up again, can you explain the process you use to design a database? We talked about collaboration, outlining a clear process. How can we add in some critical thinking in communication?
We could start by asking questions to get everyone on the same page. Like, what kind of data will be stored? How many users are expected? Any special security concerns? This shows you're thinking things through.
It says, I'm here to understand your needs. What about when you're explaining the design process?
Focus on being clear. Break down the process into steps. Use simple language and give examples to illustrate each step. Make it easy to follow.
Like you're painting a picture for them. What about when they ask about those conflicting stakeholder requirements? How do you use those beyond technical skills there?
That's where they really matter. You could talk about prioritizing based on what's important for the business, finding compromises, and being open about how decisions are made. It shows you can handle those tricky situations.
You're saying, I'm a problem solver who can work with people. Okay, let's go back to data integrity. How do you ensure data integrity in a database? We talked about techniques, examples. Where does active listening and communication fit in?
Start by acknowledging why data integrity is important. You could say data integrity is crucial, especially when you're dealing with sensitive information like financial transactions or medical records. Errors can have big consequences.
That sets the stage and shows you understand the real-world impact. Then you can explain those techniques in a way that's easy to grasp.
Right. And those real-world examples are key. Talk about using constraints to make sure data values make sense, like making sure someone's age isn't negative, or using data validation checks to prevent bad entries.
Those examples make it so much easier to understand. How can you use active listening to improve your answer even more?
Ask questions about their specific concerns. What are your data retention policies? Any audit requirements? Are there industry regulations you need to follow?
That shows you're paying attention to their needs. Okay, what about database security? How do you ensure database security? We talked about the tech stuff. How do you use communication to really build trust in your skills?
Clear communication is everything here. Start by explaining the different security layers, authentication, authorization, and encryption in a way that anyone can understand.
It's like saying, I'm fluent in security, but I can also explain it simply. Give me some examples.
For authentication, talk about strong passwords, those codes you get on your phone for online banking, things like that. For authorization, you could talk about controlling access based on roles, but explain it like giving people keys to only the rooms they need to use.
Great analogies. And for encryption, talk about how it scrambles data so no one can read it without the right key, like a secret code.
Right. Now let's look back to the SQL Server question. Have you worked with SQL Server before? If your answer is no, how do you make the most of that situation? Be honest, but then talk about your experience with other database systems and what skills you could bring to SQL Server. Show that you're a fast learner.
So instead of just no, it's more like, I haven't used this exact tool, but here's what I've learned from other tools that I can apply. What about critical thinking in this situation?
Talk about how you'd learn a new system. Mention resources you'd use, training you'd seek out, and emphasize your willingness to learn and adapt. You're a problem solver, and a new tool is just another problem to solve.
Love that. It shows initiative. Okay, back to data backups and recovery. How do you handle data backups and recovery? We talked about strategies. How can we use communication to strengthen our answer?
Start by saying why backups and recovery are so important. Something like, data is crucial for any organization, and losing it would be a disaster. A solid backup and recovery plan is essential.
That sets the tone. Now, how do you explain your backup strategy in a way that's easy to understand and engaging?
Use analogies. Compare full backups to taking a snapshot of your computer, incremental backups to saving only the files that changed since the last snapshot, and differential backups to saving all the files that changed since the last full backup.
Those make it so much easier to visualize. How can you show critical thinking when talking about recovery?
Talk about different disaster scenarios. What if a server crashes? What if there's a natural disaster? What if there's a cyber attack? By going through those, you show you're thinking beyond routine backups.
Very impressive. Okay, remember those clustered and non-clustered indexes? We use the library analogy. How can we make that explanation even better?
Explain what indexes are for in a relatable way. Imagine trying to find a book in a huge library with no index. It would take forever. Indexes are like the library's card catalog.
Perfect. How do you explain the difference between the two types without getting too technical?
Use visuals. Draw a simple diagram. Show a table of data, and then draw a clustered index as a reorganized version of that table. Then draw a non-clustered index as a separate thing pointing to the rows in the original table.
That makes it so much clearer. Okay, back to distributed databases. Have you ever designed a distributed database? We talked about honesty and transferable skills. How can we use communication to make our answer even stronger?
We can start by talking about why distributed databases are so important these days. They help with scalability, availability, and fault tolerance. Those are crucial for businesses that rely heavily on data.
That shows you understand the big picture.
Yeah.
Now, how do you show your critical thinking skills even without direct experience?
Talk about the challenges of distributed databases. Data consistency, managing transactions, the need for specialized tools and knowledge. You could even mention different architectures like sharding or replication and the pros and cons of each.
That's going deep. Okay, last question. How do you handle database migrations? We discussed planning and communication. How can we emphasize that even more?
Tell a story about a successful migration you worked on, focusing on how good communication and planning were crucial. Talk about working with stakeholders, developing a detailed plan, keeping everyone informed, and testing thoroughly.
That brings it to life, and it shows you've actually done it. Any final tips on using these beyond technical skills to nail that interview?
Remember, technical knowledge is important, but those other skills can really set you apart. Embrace them, practice them, and showcase them during your interview.
It's about showing them you're not just a database designer, but a problem solver, a communicator, a collaborator. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll leave you with a final thought and some key takeaways to help you rock that interview. Stay tuned. We're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into those database designer interviews.
We've covered so much, from what the role actually involves to career insights and those essential beyond technical skills.
And of course, we tackled all those interview questions, not just learning how to answer them, but how to really impress the interviewer.
You're leaving here with a whole toolbox of strategies and insights thanks to RoleCatcher's awesome resources.
But before we send you off to conquer that interview, we want to leave you with something to really think about, something that sparks those creative juices.
This is inspired by RoleCatcher's focus on the future of data.
Okay, hit me with it.
What's the most innovative use of data you've seen lately? And how could a database designer play a part in that?
Wow. That's a good one. It really makes you think beyond the textbook and see how database design connects to the real world.
Exactly. Maybe you're interested in personalized medicine, using data to fight climate change, or those smart cities.
Whatever it is, this question lets you show your passion for the field and your ability to think critically about the future of data.
It's a chance to shine, to show that you're not just a tech person, but someone who understands how powerful data can be.
So there you have it. You're ready to ace that database designer interview.
Remember, confidence comes from being prepared. Keep exploring RoleCatcher, practice those answers, and believe in yourself.
Go out there and show them what you've got. We're rooting for you. Until next time, happy data adventures.